Blood stained the marble floors of the Fontana estate, but the true betrayal was just beginning. When Chicago's most ruthless mafia boss woke up, supposedly blind and paralyzed, his glamorous world vanished. Only the overlooked Chubby Maid stayed behind. But she had no idea she was part of his deadly game. The Chicago underworld was a brutal machine powered by blood, extortion, and absolute loyalty. Dante Fontana, the undisputed head of the Fontana Syndicate, knew the mechanics of this machine better than anyone alive. He was a man carved from marble and violence, ruling the city's shipping ports and underground casinos with an iron fist. He wore custom suits, commanded an army of lethal enforcers, and destroyed rival families without a flicker of emotion. But even the most ruthless kings have blind spots. For Dante, his blind spot was trusting the illusion of his own invincibility. The ambush happened on a rain-swept Tuesday night outside a warehouse in the West Loop. Automatic fire from rival hitmen shattered the bulletproof glass of his armored SUV, turning the vehicle into a death trap. Dante survived the onslaught, but the narrative that hit the streets the next morning was carefully curated by his enemies. The official medical report, bought and paid for by a traitor deeply embedded within his own ranks, declared that Dante Fontana had suffered severe spinal trauma and irreversible optic nerve damage. According to the compromised doctors, the feared mafia boss was permanently paralyzed from the waist down and completely blind. When Dante woke up in the high-security medical wing of his sprawling Lake Forest estate, he kept his eyes shut. He felt the cold sting of IV needles in his arms and the suffocating silence of a fallen empire. He wiggled his toes. He could feel the fine cotton sheets. He could see the faint, rhythmic glow of the heart monitors through his eyelashes. He was entirely whole. But he knew with absolute certainty that the moment he revealed his miraculous recovery, the traitor would strike again and finish the job. He needed to flush out the rats. So Dante made a choice that required psychopathic discipline. He became a living ghost. He locked his muscles into rigid submission and stared blankly ahead, feigning utter helplessness. It did not take long for the rats to show their teeth. Vanessa Caro was the first to reveal her true face. She was his fiancée, a glamorous socialite whose family controlled the Caro smuggling ring operating out of Detroit. Their union was supposed to be a strategic merger of empires. Standing at the foot of his hospital bed, Vanessa did not shed a single tear. Dante listened closely as her designer heels clicked across the hardwood floor. She leaned over him, her perfume a suffocating cloud of synthetic roses. She waved a manicured hand aggressively in front of his unblinking eyes. When Dante did not flinch, she laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that chilled the room. She told him he was useless now, a broken toy no longer fit to rule Chicago. She whispered maliciously that she was already making arrangements to transfer his offshore accounts to her family, effectively gutting the Fontana Syndicate from the inside. Then she walked out, leaving the bedroom door wide open, abandoning him to the dark. Within 48 hours, the sprawling estate was a ghost town. The trusted lieutenants stopped visiting, busy carving up his territory. The elite security detail thinned out, bribed or intimidated by Vanessa's new allies. The glamorous staff, the private chefs and the butlers, fled like cowards from a sinking ship. Only one person stayed. Paola Barbieri was not a woman who commanded attention in the ruthless world of the Mafia elite. She was a maid, a plus-sized girl with soft, generous curves, messy brown hair, usually tied back in a hurried bun, and hands calloused from years of hard labor. Society and the syndicate elite often treated her as invisible. But Paola possessed a quiet resilience forged in the brutal fires of poverty. She was working at the estate solely to pay off her father's crippling gambling debt to the Fontana family. Before her life derailed to save her father from broken kneecaps, she had been 2 years into nursing school at Loyola University. When the professional nursing staff abandoned Dante, fearing retaliation from the rising Caro faction, Paola stepped out of the shadows. She knew the extreme danger of staying in an unprotected Mafia stronghold, but her moral compass refused to let a helpless man rot in his own bed, even if that man was known as the Devil of Chicago. Paola approached Dante's bed on the 3rd day of his isolation. Dante tracked her movements through the tiny sliver of light beneath his heavy eyelids. He noticed the way she moved, careful and quiet, respecting the space. He felt the warm, damp cloth as she gently cleaned his face, washing away the dried blood and sweat the others had ignored. She did not speak to him with the sickening pity or disgust he expected. She spoke to him like a human being. She introduced herself softly, though he already knew exactly who she was. He knew every single employee in his house. He had read her background file. But he did not know the comforting warmth of her touch, or the steady, rhythmic sound of her heartbeat when she leaned close to adjust his pillows. Dante made a silent vow right then. Paola Barbieri was the perfect pawn for his ultimate test. He would push her to the absolute breaking point. He needed to know if her kindness was just a calculated mask, if she was a secret spy left behind by Vanessa to monitor his demise, or if she was truly the only loyal, untainted soul left in his crumbling kingdom. The psychological warfare began the very next morning. Dante became a monster. If he was going to test Paola, he had to be the absolute worst version of himself. When she brought him his morning coffee, gently guiding his strong hand to the warm ceramic mug, Dante violently jerked his arm. The scalding liquid flew across the room, splashing against the pristine wallpaper and narrowly missing Paola's face. The mug shattered loudly on the hardwood floor. Dante roared, staring blindly at the ornate ceiling, cursing her incompetence, calling her clumsy and worthless. He demanded to know why they had left a useless, fat maid to care for him instead of a real doctor. He waited for her to run. He waited for the tears, the slamming door, the inevitable resignation. Instead, he heard a heavy sigh. Then the rustle of fabric as Paola knelt on the floor. She did not yell back. She simply told him in a calm, unwavering voice to hold still so he would not get glass in his feet, completely forgetting or ignoring the fact that he was supposed to be paralyzed. She meticulously swept up the shards, her breathing steady and controlled. Dante watched her from the extreme corner of his eye. Her uniform pulled tight across her broad shoulders and full hips as she worked. In a world full of starving, surgically altered socialites, Dante found himself inexplicably drawn to the soft, undeniable strength of her form. She was not fragile like Vanessa. She was grounded. She was intensely real. For 2 grueling weeks, Dante subjected Paola to a relentless barrage of cruelty. He refused to eat the meals she prepared, forcing her to coax him for hours. He woke her up at 3 in the morning by knocking a heavy metal lamp off his nightstand, demanding ice water. He hurled insults designed to cut deep into her deepest insecurities, mocking her weight, her lowly status, and her indebted father. Every insult felt like swallowing broken glass for Dante, but the Mafia boss could not afford a single moment of weakness. Yet, Paola never broke. She absorbed his dark rage like a sponge, returning it with a calm, infuriating patience. She bathed him, she fed him, and she read to him from the financial papers, keeping him updated on the city's movements without realizing she was feeding a dormant predator, crucial intelligence for his impending war. Moreover, Paola used her abandoned nursing training to manipulate his limbs, bending his knees and massaging his calves to prevent deep vein thrombosis and muscle atrophy. Dante had to use every ounce of his psychopathic willpower to keep his massive legs entirely limp, offering zero resistance while her soft, warm hands worked expertly over his skin. It was pure, unadulterated torture, not because of the physical strain, but because of the intense, burning desire it sparked in his chest. Dante's ruthless heart began to betray his cold logic. The harsh tests were meant to push her away, but instead they pulled him under. He became deeply obsessed with her natural scent, a comforting mixture of cheap vanilla soap and clean linen. He memorized the soothing cadence of her voice. He found himself desperately anticipating the soft thud of her footsteps in the empty hallway. The ruthless king of Chicago was falling into a dark, consuming obsession for the Chubby Maid, but he could not reveal his hand. Not yet. The ultimate test of her loyalty arrived unannounced on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Vanessa Caro returned to the Lake Forest estate, accompanied by two massive armed enforcers. Dante heard the heavy tires of their SUVs crunch on the gravel driveway. He immediately slowed his breathing, adopting his flawless catatonic state. Vanessa barged into the medical wing, her voice dripping with venom and arrogance. She demanded Paola step aside immediately. Vanessa had come for the biometric lockbox hidden behind the mahogany bookshelf, the secure vault holding the deeds to the downtown real estate and the override codes for the syndicate's offshore accounts. Paola stood her ground, planting herself firmly between Vanessa and the bed. Dante cracked his eyes just a millimeter to witness the confrontation. Vanessa sneered, looking Paola up and down with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She called Paola a pathetic, oversized cow playing nurse to a rotting corpse. She ordered Paola to hand over Dante's thumbprint to bypass the scanner, tossing a sharp surgical scalpel directly onto the bedside table. Vanessa wanted Paola to slice Dante's thumb off to access the vault. Dante's muscles coiled tight beneath the sheets like a striking viper. If Paola reached for that blade, he would snap her neck. If Vanessa's men moved in on her, he would spring from the bed and slaughter them all with his bare hands, blowing his cover and accelerating the syndicate war. Paola looked down at the gleaming scalpel. Then she looked up at Vanessa. Without uttering a single word, Paola grabbed the scalpel and hurled it violently out the open window into the pouring rain. She planted her feet, her plus-size frame blocking the path to Dante's bed like an impenetrable fortress wall. She told Vanessa in a voice made of pure iron that over her dead body would anyone touch a single hair on his head. Vanessa's face twisted in ugly fury. She stepped forward and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap across Paola's face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. Paola's head snapped to the side, a bright red handprint instantly blooming on her pale cheek. Dante's blood turned to liquid fire. A murderous, possessive rage, darker and more violent than anything he had ever experienced in his entire life, clawed at his throat. He wanted to rip Vanessa apart. He wanted to burn the entire Caro syndicate to ash for daring to lay a finger on his maid. But Paola did not crumble, and she did not cry. She slowly turned her face back to Vanessa, a terrifying, quiet steel shining in her dark eyes. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a heavy, solid iron fireplace poker she had apparently concealed earlier. She gripped the weapon with both hands, stepping aggressively toward Vanessa and the armed enforcers. Paola warned them that she had locked the main estate gates from the security panel and triggered the silent alarm to the local police department before they even reached the front door. It was a bluff, a brilliant, desperate, entirely fabricated bluff, but Paola delivered it with the cold conviction of a seasoned mob boss. She told Vanessa to get out of her ward before she smashed her skull in. Vanessa, cowardly at her core and unwilling to deal with local authorities while secretly orchestrating a delicate Mafia coup, backed away. She spat a final vile curse at Paola, promising to return with a small army, and stormed out with her confused men in tow. When the heavy oak front doors slammed shut downstairs, the suffocating silence returned to the master bedroom. Paola dropped the iron poker. It clattered loudly on the floorboards. She collapsed into the armchair beside Dante's bed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the massive spike of adrenaline finally faded. Dante lay perfectly still in the shadows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had his absolute answer. Paola Barbieri was not a spy. She was a fiercely loyal, incredibly brave protector who had just risked her own life for a man she truly believed was broken, blind, and cruel. The tests were officially over. Dante Fontana had found his queen. Now it was time for the dead man to rise, and the streets of Chicago were going to run red with the blood of anyone who had ever made Paola feel invisible. The rain continued to lash against the master bedroom windows, masking the sound of Paola's ragged breathing. She sat slumped in the oversized armchair, her hands trembling as the adrenaline crashed out of her system. She stared at the floorboards, mentally preparing herself for the inevitable moment when Vanessa would return to break down the doors. Paola knew she was entirely out of her depth, a nursing school dropout playing a deadly game against seasoned cartel killers. But looking at the motionless form of Dante Fontana on the bed, she knew she would not run. Then the impossible happened. The heavy mattress creaked. It was not the subtle shift of a man adjusting his weight. It was the deliberate, muscular sound of a body rising. Paola's head snapped up. Her breath caught in her throat, choking her. Dante Fontana was sitting up, his broad chest, marked with faded scars and fresh surgical tape, rose and fell in a steady, powerful rhythm. He reached up with the hands that were supposed to be dead, the hands she had massaged and washed for weeks, and calmly pulled the IV lines from his forearms. A few drops of blood beaded on his skin, but he did not flinch. He swung his massive legs over the edge of the mattress, his feet planted firmly on the hardwood floor. Paola pressed herself into the back of the armchair, her mind fracturing, trying to comprehend the sight. Dante stood up, rising to his full, terrifying height of 6'4". He did not stumble. He did not sway. He looked down at her, and for the first time in a month, his dark, piercing eyes locked directly onto hers. They were not milky or vacant. They were sharp, lethal, and burning with an intensity that made Paola feel entirely consumed. "You are not blind," Paola whispered, the words scraping against her dry throat. "You are not paralyzed." Dante closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He moved like a predatory cat, entirely silent and devastatingly quick. He knelt in front of her chair, his massive frame boxing her in. He raised a large, calloused hand and hovered it just an inch from her face. Paola flinched, bracing for the same cruelty he had shown her for weeks. But his touch, when it landed, was incredibly gentle. His long fingers traced the angry red handprint Vanessa had left on her cheek. A dark, murderous shadow passed over Dante's face as he felt the heat of the bruise. "I had to know who the rats were," Dante said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Paola's chest. "I had to know who ordered the hit, and I had to see who would stay when the money and the power vanished. I played a dead man, Paola, and the entire city danced on my grave. My own fiancé sold me out to the Detroit syndicates. My lieutenants divided my ports." Paola stared at him, anger finally slicing through her shock. "You tortured me," she accused, her voice shaking with fresh betrayal. "You threw hot coffee. You mocked my family. You made me believe I was caring for a broken man. You used me." Dante did not deny it. He leaned closer, his scent of sandalwood and dark musk wrapping around her. "I tested you," he corrected quietly. "I pushed you into the dark to see if you would break. I surrounded you with monsters, and instead of running, you picked up a piece of iron and stood your ground to protect a man who had done nothing but treat you like garbage." He moved his thumb across her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "You are the only real thing in my entire world, Paola. Everyone else is plastic and greed. They look at your curves, your softness, and they think you are weak. I look at you, and I see an absolute fortress. You bled for me today. You claimed me as yours when you stood in front of that door. Now I am claiming you as mine." Paola wanted to push him away, to tell him he was insane. But the magnetic pull of his obsession was intoxicating. He was the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, and he was kneeling at her feet, looking at her like she was a goddess. Dante stood up, his demeanor shifting instantly from fiercely tender to calculating and cold. He walked to the mahogany bookshelf, the same one Vanessa had tried to breach. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner hidden beneath a hollowed-out Hemingway novel. A heavy click echoed through the room. The shelf swung open, revealing a steel-reinforced armory and a secure communications terminal. Dante pulled out a sleek, untraceable satellite phone and dialed a sequence of numbers. He put the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Paola. "Marcus," Dante said into the receiver. "The dead man is awake. Mobilize the loyalists. Lock down the city limits. Nobody flies out of O'Hare, and nobody crosses the state lines. I want the Caro Syndicate dismantled by midnight." Dante hung up and began pulling tactical gear from the vault. He strapped a custom holster over his broad shoulders and slid twin suppressed pistols into place. He turned back to Paola, his expression hardening into stone. "Your father's gambling debt to my family is erased," Dante told her, tossing a heavy encrypted keycard onto her lap. "Take that card. Go to the sub-basement. There is a secure panic room behind the wine cellar that not even Vanessa knows about. You lock yourself inside, and you do not open that door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" Paola gripped the keycard, her knuckles turning white. "What are you going to do?" Dante pulled a sleek black jacket over his holsters, transforming back into the ruthless Mafia boss the city feared. "I am going to take out the trash," he said softly. "And then I am coming back for my queen." The Fontana high-rise in the heart of the Chicago Loop was a monument of glass and steel. On the top floor, in the sprawling executive boardroom overlooking the glittering city skyline, Vanessa Caro was celebrating her coronation. She sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a flute of vintage champagne in her hand, surrounded by the traitorous capos of the Fontana family and her own Detroit enforcers. Spread across the table were the transfer deeds for the shipping ports, the casino licenses, and the offshore accounts. All she needed was a forged signature to finalize the hostile takeover. Vanessa laughed, a sharp, triumphant sound, as she recounted the story of the pathetic, overweight maid trying to defend the rotting vegetable back at the estate. The heavy double doors of the boardroom did not open. They shattered inward. A concussion grenade detonated in the center of the room, a blinding flash of white light and a deafening roar that shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows. The champagne flutes exploded. The capos screamed, diving for the carpet. Through the dense, acrid smoke, a figure walked into the room. Vanessa scrambled backward in her leather chair, coughing violently, her ears ringing. As the smoke cleared, the blood drained entirely from her face. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the Italian marble floor. Dante Fontana stood at the head of the table. He was fully dressed in a midnight black suit, perfectly composed, and holding a suppressed tactical pistol. He looked like the devil incarnate. 4 of Dante's most loyal enforcers, led by the towering Marcus, swept into the room behind him, their assault rifles leveled at the Detroit men. The takeover was stopped dead in its tracks. "You look like you have seen a ghost, Vanessa," Dante said, his voice carrying clearly over the moans of the disoriented traitors. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. She looked at Dante's legs, expecting them to buckle, but he stood planted like an oak tree. "You are paralyzed," she whispered, pure terror leaking from her eyes. "The doctors said you were broken." "I bought the doctors after you paid them off," Dante replied smoothly. "A simple counter-bribe. It is amazing what people will believe when they are blinded by their own greed." Dante raised his pistol. He did not hesitate, and he did not monologue. He fired 2 precise, silenced shots. The 2 Detroit enforcers standing closest to Vanessa dropped to the floor, dead before they even registered the threat. The remaining traitors threw their weapons away, falling to their knees and begging for mercy. Dante ignored them. He walked slowly around the table, his heavy footsteps echoing like a death knell. He stopped right beside Vanessa's chair. She was weeping now, her glamorous facade completely destroyed, her designer dress stained with spilled champagne and the blood of her bodyguards. "Please, Dante," she sobbed, reaching out to touch his sleeve. "It was just business. You know how this world works. We can still rule together. We can merge the families." Dante looked down at her with absolute disgust. He remembered the sharp crack of her hand striking Paola's face. He remembered the vile words she had used to describe the woman who had protected him. "You touched what is mine," Dante said softly, his voice colder than the Chicago winter. "You struck a woman who has more courage in her little finger than your entire bloodline. There will be no merger, Vanessa. There will only be a massacre." He signaled to Marcus. "Take her to the processing plant in the meat-packing district. Strip her family of every single asset they own. Send the deeds to the Detroit bosses and tell them if they ever step foot in Chicago again, I will burn their city to the ground." As Marcus dragged the screaming, thrashing Vanessa out of the boardroom, Dante looked out at the city lights. His empire was secure. The rats were dead or captured. But the victory felt hollow in the sterile boardroom. He needed to get home. An hour later, Dante descended the stone steps into the cavernous wine cellar of the Lake Forest estate. He bypassed the vintage racks and stood before the seamless steel door of the panic room. He pressed his hand to the scanner. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a mechanical clunk. He stepped inside. The bunker was stark, lit by emergency fluorescent lights. Paola was sitting on a metal cot in the corner, still wearing her slightly rumpled maid uniform. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes wide and searching. Dante took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto a nearby chair. He unbuckled his holsters, letting the heavy weapons clatter onto the table. He wanted no barriers between them. He walked over to her and dropped to his knees on the cold concrete floor, resting his hands gently on her full, soft thighs. "It is done," he told her quietly. "The city is mine again. Vanessa is gone. She will never hurt you, and she will never insult you again." Paola looked down at him, her chest heaving. The man before her was a killer, a ruthless syndicate boss who had just orchestrated a violent purge. Yet he was looking at her with a raw, undeniable reverence. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and ran her hand through his thick, dark hair. Dante closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a starving man. "I am just a maid, Dante," Paola whispered, a tear finally escaping her eye and rolling down her cheek. "I am a dropout with a mountain of debt. I do not belong in this world. Look at me. I do not fit in your mansions or your high society parties." Dante's eyes snapped open, fierce and protective. He grabbed her hands, kissing her knuckles, entirely unbothered by her calluses. "You are exactly where you belong. You belong by my side. Those high society women are starving ghosts. You are warm, you are real, and you possess a fire that kept me alive in the dark." He stood up, pulling Paola up with him. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her generous curves flush against his hard, muscular chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of vanilla and clean linen that had become his only anchor to sanity. "You are no longer a maid, Paola Barbieri," Dante vowed, his lips brushing against her pulse point, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Tomorrow, the entire city will know your name. You are the woman who saved the devil of Chicago. You are my queen, and I will destroy anyone who fails to bow." He captured her lips in a fierce, consuming kiss, sealing his promise in the dark of the bunker. The Mafia boss had risen from the dead, but it was the overlooked Chubby Maid who had truly conquered his ruthless heart. Did Dante's brutal revenge and intense obsession give you chills? If you loved watching this powerful Mafia boss protect his fiercely loyal plus-size queen, hit that like button right now. Share this gripping dark romance story with your friends who love high-stakes Mafia drama. Drop a comment below, telling us your favorite twist. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, original underworld storytelling. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video.